Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. On the outskirts of Blackthorn, nestled between shadowy woods and a winding river, stood an ancient bridge that the locals called the Devil's Crossing. Built in the 1800s, it was said to be cursed, a sinister piece of architecture that stretched over the restless waters of Blackthorn Creek. The bridge's stonework was cracked and moss-covered, and it seemed to sag under the weight of its dark history. For as long as anyone could remember, the bridge was a place of whispered stories and chilling warnings. Every Halloween, without fail, someone from the town would vanish without a trace. The missing were never found, and the only thing connecting their disappearances was that they were last seen near the bridge. The curse, they said, began long ago, born of a sinister deal struck between a desperate man and an entity that demanded payment in blood. Some believed it was the devil himself. Others spoke of a vengeful spirit bound to the bridge. Either way, the price of the deal was eternal, claiming a soul every year as payment, and every Halloween, the town waited in dread, wondering who would be next. 17-year-old Clara Matthews had heard the stories her whole life. Her grandmother, a lifelong resident of Blackthorn, had told her about the curse many times. "Stay away from the bridge on Halloween, Clara," her grandmother warned every year without fail. "The bridge doesn't care who you are. If you're there when it's time, it'll take you." Clara always rolled her eyes. "It's just a story, Grandma. People go missing everywhere. It doesn't mean the bridge is cursed." Her grandmother's lined face grew serious. "You think it's a joke? I knew people who disappeared. My best friend Mary, when I was just a girl. She was only 16, and they found her scarf by the bridge the next morning. Nothing else. Gone." Clara shivered but didn't let it show. She didn't believe in curses. People in Blackthorn liked to hold on to their spooky legends because it made their quiet little town feel important. Still, as Halloween approached, Clara couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. The townsfolk whispered about the curse in hushed tones, parents kept their children close, and an uneasy silence fell over the streets after dark. But for Clara and her friends, Halloween was a night for fun, not fear. That Halloween, Clara, her best friend Rachel, and a group of their friends gathered in the old cemetery near Blackthorn Woods. They were dressed in makeshift costumes, carrying flashlights and bags of candy, their laughter echoing in the crisp night air. As the night wore on and the group grew braver, talk inevitably turned to the Devil's Crossing. "We should go," said Jake, the group's self-proclaimed daredevil. He grinned, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on his face. "What's Halloween without a little scare?" Rachel frowned. "Are you crazy? It's one thing to talk about it, but actually going? No way." "Come on," Jake pressed. "It's just an old bridge. The curse isn't real. Unless..." He smirked at Clara. "You're scared." Clara stiffened. "I'm not scared. It's just a stupid story." "Prove it," Jake said, his grin widening. "Let's go to the bridge. Just for a few minutes. Whoever stays the longest wins." The others hesitated, but Clara, feeling the weight of Jake's challenge, shrugged. "Fine, let's go. It's not like the bridge is going to eat us." Rachel grabbed her arm. "Clara, don't. You've heard the stories." Clara smiled reassuringly. "It's just a bridge, Rachel. Nothing's going to happen." The group made their way through the dark woods, the crunch of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl their only companions. Blackthorn Creek glistened in the moonlight, its waters flowing fast and cold. When they reached the bridge, it looked even more menacing than Clara had imagined. The stones were worn and slick with moss, the iron railings twisted and jagged. A heavy mist clung to the air, swirling around their ankles as they stepped closer. Jake was the first to step onto the bridge, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "See? Nothing to it." Clara followed, her heart pounding despite herself. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the bridge carried its own sinister energy. Rachel and the others stayed at the edge, refusing to cross. "You guys are such babies," Jake called back, standing in the center of the bridge. He spread his arms wide. Come on, curse, do your worst. Jake, stop it, Clara snapped. It's not funny. But then something changed. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The mist thickened, swirling like ghostly fingers around their feet. Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming until it was almost useless. And then they heard it, a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. Clara froze. Did you hear that? Jake laughed nervously. It's just the wind. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct. The words were impossible to understand, but they were there, circling them, coming from the bridge itself. Rachel screamed from the edge of the bridge. Let's go! This isn't funny anymore. Clara turned to follow, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The whispering seemed to press into her mind, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Clara, Jake said, his voice shaking, we should... Before he could finish, the air around them erupted into chaos. The mist surged upward, forming a towering shape in the middle of the bridge. It was neither man nor woman, its form constantly shifting, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. The whispers turned into a deafening roar. The figure stretched out a hand, or something like a hand, toward Clara. She felt her body go cold, as if the life were being drained from her. Run! Jake shouted, grabbing her arm. He pulled her toward the edge of the bridge, but the mist seemed to block their path, solidifying into an impenetrable wall. The figure loomed closer, its voice echoing in her mind. Every year one must stay, one must pay. No! Clara screamed, struggling against the pull of the mist. Take me instead! Jake's eyes widened in horror. Clara, no! But it was too late. The figure reached her, and everything went black. The next morning, the town awoke to the news of another disappearance. Clara Matthews was gone, last seen on the bridge by her terrified friends. The townspeople shook their heads, muttering about the curse and the foolishness of youth. Rachel and Jake never spoke of what they saw that night. But every Halloween, when the air grew cold and the mist rolled in, Rachel swore she could hear Clara's voice on the wind, whispering from the bridge. Don't come back. The Devil's Crossing remained, waiting for its next soul. It stood at the edge of a desolate highway, a relic of a bygone era. The Last Stop Diner, as its neon sign once proudly proclaimed, had been abandoned for decades. Its cracked windows, faded red booths, and rusted exterior were all that remained of a place that had once been a beacon of warmth and comfort for weary travelers. But despite its dilapidated state, locals never dared approach it. There were stories, terrible stories about what had happened there and why the diner had closed so suddenly. Some said it was cursed. Others whispered of strange disappearances and chilling sounds that came from the empty building on quiet nights. But no one could deny that something dark lingered at the diner. So when the news broke that the Last Stop Diner was reopening, the small town of Clearwater was buzzing with curiosity and dread. Sam Weston, the new owner, was an out-of-towner who claimed he had no knowledge of the diner's sinister reputation. He was a middle-aged man with a hopeful smile and big dreams of turning the place into a thriving roadside attraction. He spent months renovating it, bringing it back to life. The neon sign flickered to life for the first time in decades. The red booths gleamed under fresh lighting, and the smell of coffee and burgers once again filled the air. To celebrate, Sam announced a grand reopening on Halloween night. It's just a diner, Sam told the skeptical locals when they expressed concern, and it's got the best burgers in town. Come see for yourselves. Despite their fears, curiosity got the better of many Clearwater residents. On the night of the reopening, the parking lot was full, the diner buzzing with chatter and laughter. It seemed, at least for the moment, that the stories were just that, stories. But then the clock struck midnight. The crowd was thinning, with only a few patrons lingering over their coffee and pie. Sam was in the back cleaning up when the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual, old wiring, he thought. But when they flickered again, a strange chill swept through the diner, sending shivers down the spines of those still inside. One of the waitresses, Maggie, stopped mid-step. Did anyone else feel that? She asked, her voice unsteady. The patrons exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly, the jukebox in the corner sprang to life, playing a scratchy, distorted tune. It was an old love song, but the melody was warped, as though something was pressing on the record with invisible hands. "That thing's not even plugged in," Sam said, emerging from the kitchen. Everyone stared at the jukebox as the song grew louder, the distortion turning into what sounded like faint whispers layered beneath the music. And then, the door to the kitchen slammed shut on its own. The whispers grew louder, this time coming from every corner of the diner. Maggie backed away, clutching her apron. "Sam, what's going on?" I don't know," Sam stammered, his face pale. He moved toward the kitchen door, but as he reached for the handle, it flew open, revealing an empty room beyond. The air inside was cold enough to see his breath, and the faint smell of decay wafted out. "I think it's time to leave," one of the patrons said, standing up. But when he reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, but it was as though the door had been welded shut. "We're locked in?" Maggie's voice was trembling now. Sam grabbed a chair and tried to break one of the windows, but the glass didn't even crack. And then they saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the diner. It was barely visible at first, blending into the dim lighting. But as they watched, it began to move. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, its form flickering like a damaged film reel. The air grew colder with every inch it moved closer, and the whispers turned into a low, guttural growl. "What the hell is that?" one of the patrons screamed. The figure stopped in the middle of the diner, and the lights dimmed further, plunging the room into near darkness. Suddenly, more shadows began to appear, figures that flickered into existence, their forms translucent and warped. "They're people," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible over the growling. The shadows resembled men and women from different eras, their clothing old-fashioned and tattered. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, and their mouths moved as though screaming, but no sound came out. "They're the ones who disappeared," an old man muttered, his voice shaking. "The stories, they're true." Sam looked at the shadows, horror dawning on his face. "What are you talking about?" The old man's hands trembled. "The ones who were last seen here, travelers, locals, they were taken by something. The diner never let them leave." As the shadows grew closer, the whispers in the diner coalesced into words. "You should, not have returned." Sam backed away, shaking his head. "I didn't do anything. I just reopened the diner." The largest shadow, the one that had appeared first, stepped forward. Its form began to change, becoming clearer until it resembled a man in a blood-stained apron. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes burning with anger. "You disturbed us," the figure growled, its voice echoing through the room. "This place is ours. It feeds on souls. It cannot be allowed to rest." Sam fell to his knees. "I didn't know." The figure loomed over him, its form twisting into something monstrous. "Now you do." The lights in the diner began to flash wildly, and the walls seemed to close in. The shadows surged forward, enveloping the remaining patrons one by one. Maggie screamed as one of the shadows grabbed her arm, its touch freezing and burning at the same time. "Let us out," she begged. But the door remained locked, and the shadows were relentless. Sam tried to fight back, swinging a chair at the figures, but his efforts were futile. The shadows passed through him like smoke, leaving him gasping for air. The jukebox crackled again, this time playing a distorted recording of a man's voice. It was a chilling message. "Leave while you still can." By dawn, the diner was silent once more. The neon sign flickered off, and the building stood as it always had, still, dark, and foreboding. When the police arrived, responding to a report of screams heard in the night, they found the diner empty. No signs of Sam, Maggie, or the patrons remained, though the coffee on the counter was still warm, and the booths bore fresh impressions, as if someone had just been sitting there. The only clue was a single phrase scratched into the counter. The last stop diner remained closed after that, its reopening nothing more than a fleeting blip in its cursed history. The locals avoided it even more than before, and soon the stories of its reopening faded into the realm of legend. But on quiet nights, travelers along the desolate highway swore they could see the diner's neon sign flicker to life and hear faint whispers calling them inside. Those who stopped to investigate were never seen again. The lights in the diner began to flash wildly, and the walls seemed to close in, The shadows surged forward, enveloping the remaining patrons one by one. Maggie screamed as one of the shadows grabbed her arm, its touch freezing and burning at the same time. "Let us out," she begged. But the door remained locked, and the shadows were relentless. Sam tried to fight back, swinging a chair at the figures, but his efforts were futile. The shadows passed through him like smoke, leaving him gasping for air. The jukebox crackled again, this time playing a distorted recording of a man's voice. It was a chilling message. "Leave while you still can." By dawn, the diner was silent once more. The neon sign flickered off, and the building stood as it always had, still, dark and foreboding. When the police arrived, responding to a report of screams heard in the night, they found the diner empty. No signs of Sam, Maggie, or the patrons remained, though the coffee on the counter was still warm, and the booths bore fresh impressions, as if someone had just been sitting there. The only clue was a single phrase scratched into the counter. The Last Stop Diner remained closed after that, its reopening nothing more than a fleeting blip in its cursed history. The locals avoided it even more than before, and soon the stories of its reopening faded into the realm of legend. But on quiet nights, travelers along the desolate highway swore they could see the diner's neon sign flicker to life and hear faint whispers calling them inside. Those who stopped to investigate were never seen again. That Saturday, a modest crowd gathered in the parking lot, their chatter hushed and wary. The owner, a man named Henry Blake, emerged to greet them. He was a middle-aged stranger with an easy smile and no known ties to the area. "Rustwood Diner's back in business," he announced cheerfully, cutting a red ribbon stretched across the entrance. The doors swung open, releasing a faint but unmistakable scent of coffee and pancakes, mingled with something colder, something metallic. Inside, the diner looked like a perfect snapshot of the past. Red leather booths, a polished countertop with spinning stools, and a jukebox that seemed to hum with life. It was all too perfect, too pristine, as if time had never touched it. Henry shrugged off questions about how he'd managed such a restoration, claiming he had a passion for history and a knack for repairs. The reopening drew a steady stream of customers. Nostalgic locals came to relive their childhood memories, while out-of-town travelers stopped in for the novelty. At first, everything seemed normal. The coffee was hot, the pie was as good as people remembered, and the jukebox played oldies. But then strange things began to happen. A waitress named Clara was refilling a customer's coffee when she noticed movement in the mirror behind the counter. A man in a black suit stood near the entrance, his face obscured by shadow. When she turned to greet him, no one was there. Later, a family of 4 dining in a booth swore they heard whispers coming from the vent above their table. The whispers sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once, their words unintelligible but urgent. The youngest child began to cry, claiming she felt cold fingers brushing her hair. By midnight, only a handful of patrons remained, their laughter and conversation masking an undercurrent of unease. Then the jukebox skipped. The cheerful melody of Rock Around the Clock warped and slowed, distorting into a low, guttural groan. The lights flickered. A trucker named Sam, sitting alone at the counter, laughed nervously. "Guess the wiring's still from the 50s, huh?" But as he spoke, the coffee in his cup rippled, as if disturbed by a tremor. The tremor grew into a vibration, then into a violent shake. Dishes rattled, and a glass crashed to the floor. The lights went out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. For a moment, all was silent, until a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. When the lights flickered back on, Sam was gone. His stool spun slowly, but there was no sign of him. His plate of food sat untouched, steam still rising from his coffee. Word spread quickly about the bizarre events at Rustwood Diner. By morning, police were swarming the place. Henry Blake insisted he had no idea what had happened. "The man probably just left," he said, though his unease was palpable. The officers found no trace of Sam inside or outside the diner. Surveillance cameras, newly installed as part of the renovation, had inexplicably malfunctioned during the blackout. Strangest of all, a thin layer of frost coated the counter where Sam had been sitting, despite the warm summer air. Despite the mysterious disappearance, the diner stayed open. Henry offered reassurances, even giving out free meals to prove it was safe. But the disappearances didn't stop. A couple passing through town vanished after dining at Rustwood. A teenage boy who dared his friends to spend the night there was never seen again. Each time the diner seemed untouched, its interior as pristine as ever, the food still warm on the tables. Determined to uncover the truth, Clara began researching the diner's history. Late one night, she found a newspaper article from 1973. It detailed the original disappearances, but included a detail she hadn't heard before. The owner at the time, Walter Grayson, had been deeply involved in the occult. Neighbors reported seeing strange symbols carved into the diner's foundation and hearing chants late at night. Walter himself had vanished along with everyone else. Clara returned to the diner after hours, flashlight in hand. She pried up a loose floorboard behind the counter and found a trapdoor leading to a basement she hadn't known existed. The air below was icy, and the walls were lined with shelves of dusty books and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. At the center of the room was a table carved with intricate otherworldly symbols. In the middle of the table sat an old record player, a vinyl record spinning silently. As Clara leaned closer, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw figures materializing from the shadows. Men and women in 1950s attire, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Among them was Sam, his face frozen in a silent scream. The record began to play, emitting a haunting melody that echoed through the basement. The figures surrounded Clara, their ghostly hands reaching for her as the air grew colder and darker. Days later, the diner was found abandoned once again. Plates of half-eaten food sat on tables. The jukebox played a single haunting tune, and the sign outside flickered weakly. No one ever saw Henry Blake or Clara again. Rustwood Diner became a ghost story once more, its reopening a fleeting nightmare that faded into local lore. But on quiet nights, travelers still report seeing the neon sign glowing faintly in the distance, and some claim to hear faint whispers calling them inside. Few dare to stop. Those who do are never seen again. In the small, forgotten town of Briar Hollow, a sinister legend whispered through generations. The tale of Whispering Pines Playground. Once a lively spot where children laughed and played, it had been abandoned for decades, shrouded in mystery and fear. The playground was hidden at the edge of a dense pine forest, its rusted swings and decayed carousel barely visible through the overgrowth. Parents warned their children never to go near it, and for good reason. The place was cursed. The story dated back to 1952, when a terrible tragedy befell the town. Whispering Pines was hosting a community picnic, and nearly every family in Briar Hollow was in attendance. The day was perfect. Blue skies, the scent of barbecue in the air, and the joyful squeals of children as they raced from the swings to the slide. Then, without warning, everything changed. It started with the air. A chilling wind swept through the playground, carrying an unnatural silence with it. The children stopped playing, their laughter replaced by confused murmurs. And then, one by one, they began to scream. Parents rushed to their children, only to find them collapsing to the ground, pale and unresponsive. The town doctor could do nothing. That day, 13 children died, their lifeless bodies scattered across the playground like broken dolls. No one could explain what had happened. Some blamed a gas leak, others a rare illness. But as the years went on, darker theories emerged, whispers of a curse tied to the land itself. The playground was abandoned, left to rot as a memorial to the lost children, but the townsfolk noticed strange things in the years that followed. On moonlit nights, people claimed to hear the faint sound of laughter coming from the forest. Others swore they saw swings moving on their own, or the dim glow of small figures darting between the trees. Decades later, in 2024, the legend of Whispering Pines Playground had become a favorite dare among the local teenagers. Every year, a group of thrill seekers would venture into the woods at night, armed with flashlights and bravado, to see if the stories were true. This year, it was Ellie, Marcus, and Jonah's turn. The three friends had grown up hearing the tales but had never seen the playground for themselves. On Halloween night, they decided to test their courage. "It's just a bunch of old swings and some creepy stories," Marcus said as they hiked through the woods. "We're going to take a picture, prove we were there, and be done." Jonah, the most superstitious of the group, hesitated. "I don't know, man. My grandma used to say you should never go looking for the dead." They might be looking for you too, Ellie laughed. Come on, Jonah, it's just a story. Let's go before you chicken out. The forest was eerily quiet as they approached the playground. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rusted equipment tangled in vines. The swings creaked in the wind, and the merry-go-round sat tilted, its paint long faded. It's just old junk, Ellie said, stepping onto the cracked asphalt. See? Nothing to be scared of? But as the clock struck midnight, the air changed. A low, haunting hum began to rise, like the sound of distant singing. The friends froze, their breaths visible in the sudden chill. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Do you hear that? Jonah whispered, clutching his flashlight tightly. Ellie nodded, her bravado fading. It's probably just the wind. But then the swings began to move, not gently as if pushed by the breeze, but violently, as if unseen hands were yanking them back and forth. The merry-go-round started to spin, its rusted chains clinking in the silence. Okay, this is officially creepy, Marcus said, backing away. Before they could leave, a sound stopped them in their tracks. A child's laughter, high-pitched and chilling. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the shadows. At first, they looked like normal children, dressed in outdated clothing, overalls, floral dresses, and saddle shoes. But as the flashlights illuminated their faces, the friends saw the truth. The children's eyes were hollow, their skin pale and translucent. Dark veins webbed across their hands and faces, and their mouths twisted into unnatural smiles. Stay with us, one of the children whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Marcus screamed and bolted toward the trees, but as soon as he reached the edge of the playground, he slammed into an invisible barrier. He fell to the ground, dazed, and looked up to see the ghostly children surrounding him. You can't leave, a boy said, his voice filled with both sorrow and malice. We didn't get to leave. Ellie and Jonah tried to pull Marcus to his feet, but the ghostly children were closing in. The air grew colder, and the friends could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on them. Why are you doing this? Ellie shouted, tears streaming down her face. A small girl stepped forward, her dress torn and her hair matted. We're lonely, she said simply. We've been waiting for so long. Jonah, desperate, remembered something his grandmother had told him about spirits. They're trapped, he said. They can't move on. There's something keeping them here. The children's faces twisted with anger. It's not our fault, one of them cried. He made us stay. Who? Ellie asked. Before the children could answer, the ground beneath the merry-go-round cracked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From it emerged a shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its eyes glowed red, and its voice was a guttural growl. You shouldn't have come here, it said. The ghostly children screamed and scattered, their forms flickering like dying candles. The figure advanced on the friends, its presence suffocating. Run! Jonah yelled, dragging Marcus to his feet. The three of them sprinted through the playground, dodging swings and slides that seemed to move on their own. The barrier at the edge of the woods shimmered, but Ellie didn't stop. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her keychain, which held a small crucifix. Please work, she whispered, holding it up. The shadowy figure recoiled, its form dissolving into mist. The barrier flickered, and the friends burst through it, collapsing onto the forest floor. They never spoke of that night again, but they weren't the same. Marcus moved away, refusing to set foot in Briar Hollow again. Jonah became obsessed with researching the paranormal, determined to uncover the truth about the playground's curse. Ellie avoided the woods entirely, her once bold spirit replaced by quiet caution. Whispering Pine's playground remained as it always was, a rotting relic of a dark past. But on moonlit nights, the swings still creaked, and the faint laughter of children echoed through the trees. Margaret Maggie Walsh sat alone in her dimly lit living room, clutching a glass of red wine. The house was too quiet now, the air heavy with the absence of her husband, Daniel. He had passed away 3 months ago in a tragic car accident, leaving Maggie shattered. Every corner of their home held a memory of him, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the bedroom, the coffee mug he always used still sitting on the counter. For weeks, Maggie had been spiraling, consumed by her grief. Friends and family tried to comfort her, but their words felt hollow. No one understood what it was like to lose someone who had been her entire world for over a decade. On this particular night, as a steady rain tapped against the windows, Maggie stared at her phone. It had become her lifeline, a distraction from the unbearable silence. She scrolled through old text conversations with Daniel, reading his messages, hearing his voice in her head. Pick up milk on the way home. Love you. Don't wait up. Late meeting. Love you. Miss you already. Her thumb hovered over the delete button on his contact, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Deleting his number felt like erasing a piece of him, and she wasn't ready for that. She sighed, setting the phone down, and leaned back on the couch, letting the wine work its way through her system. She must have drifted off because when the faint buzz of her phone startled her awake, the clock on the wall read 2:13 a.m. Frowning, Maggie picked up her phone. A single notification blinked on the screen. Her heart stopped. Maggie stared at the screen, her mind racing. It had to be a mistake, or maybe a cruel prank. She opened the message with trembling fingers. Hey Maggie, it's me. Don't freak out. Her breath hitched. The message was simple, but the sender's name was unmistakable. Daniel Walsh. She sat frozen, unsure what to do. Her first instinct was to call the number, but she hesitated. What if someone had hacked his account, or worse, stolen his phone? But then, Daniel's phone had been destroyed in the accident. She had seen it herself, shattered and irreparable. The phone buzzed again. I know this is weird. I need you to listen to me. Maggie's hands shook as she typed a reply. Who is this? This isn't funny. The response came almost instantly. It's me, Maggie. It's Daniel. I can prove it. Her heart raced. She wanted to believe it, but the logical part of her mind screamed that this was impossible. And yet there was something about the phrasing, the casual tone, something deeply familiar. Prove it, she typed, her breath shallow. The reply made her drop the phone. Our honeymoon in Paris. The hotel messed up our room, so we ended up on the balcony all night, drinking cheap wine and watching the Eiffel Tower lights. You said it was the best mistake of your life. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. She had never told anyone about that night. Not the details, not how it had felt like magic despite the chaos. It had been their little secret. How? She typed, her hands unsteady. I don't have much time, came the reply. I need to warn you. Maggie's heart pounded as she stared at the screen. A warning? From Daniel? Her grief and confusion mingled with a new emotion. Fear. Warn me about what? She replied. This time the response took longer. The ellipsis indicating Daniel was typing lingered for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't an accident, Maggie. Her blood ran cold. What do you mean? What wasn't an accident? My death. Someone tampered with the brakes. The words hit her like a freight train. Maggie had always struggled to make sense of Daniel's death. He had been a careful driver, and the accident report said the crash was caused by brake failure. She had written it off as a tragic malfunction. But now... Who? She demanded, her grief giving way to a desperate need for answers. Who would do that to you? Another long pause. Someone close to you. Her mind raced, cycling through faces. Friends, family, co-workers. Who could possibly want Daniel dead? Why are you telling me this now? She typed, tears streaming down her face. Because they're watching you too. The room seemed to close in around her. She glanced at the windows, half expecting to see a shadowy figure outside. What do I do? Trust no one. Check the safe. Everything you need is there. Maggie froze. The safe. It was hidden behind a false panel in their bedroom closet, a place only she and Daniel knew about. She hadn't opened it since his death. Gripping her phone tightly, Maggie hurried to the bedroom, flipping on every light along the way. Her heart pounded as she opened the closet door and pushed aside the neatly hung clothes. Her fingers found the hidden latch, and with a soft click, the panel slid aside, revealing the small metal safe. She punched in the code, their wedding anniversary. The door swung open, and inside was a thick envelope marked with her name in Daniel's handwriting. Beside it lay a USB drive and a small black notebook. Maggie sank to the floor, clutching the envelope. She opened it with shaking hands and pulled out a letter. Maggie, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I've been investigating some things at work, and I think I've uncovered something dangerous. I didn't want to involve you, but if I'm gone, you need to know the truth. Start with the USB drive. It'll explain everything. Trust no one, not even the people you think you know. I love you always. Daniel. Her vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to focus. She grabbed her laptop and plugged in the USB drive. The drive contained a series of files, documents, emails, and recordings. As she sifted through them, a horrifying picture emerged. Daniel had been investigating corruption at his company, a high-profile tech firm. He had discovered evidence of embezzlement and illegal dealings involving powerful people. One name stood out, a man Daniel had trusted, his business partner, Paul Grayson. The files revealed that Paul had been funneling money into offshore accounts and had orchestrated the deaths of those who threatened to expose him. Daniel's last email, sent just days before his death, was addressed to Paul. It was clear, direct, and damning. I know what you've done. Either you come clean, or I go to the authorities. Maggie's stomach turned. Paul had been at Daniel's funeral. He had hugged her, told her he was devastated. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. He knows you're on to him. Leave the house, now. A loud knock at the front door made her jump. Her heart raced as she grabbed the notebook and USB drive, stuffing them into her bag. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Maggie, it's Paul! Open up! Her blood turned to ice. She crept out the back door, slipping into the rainy night. Her phone buzzed one final time as she disappeared into the darkness. I'll always protect you. Love you. And then, just like that, the messages stopped. Maggie never heard from Daniel again, but his warning saved her life. The evidence he left behind exposed Paul and his crimes, leading to his arrest. Though Maggie would always miss Daniel, she found solace in knowing that even in death, he had watched over her. And sometimes late at night, she still left her phone on the bedside table, hoping for one last message. Elliot Carter had been a photographer for as long as he could remember. It started when he was 10, using his father's old Polaroid to snap blurry pictures of sunsets and his dog, Max. Over the years, his love for photography grew into a passion and eventually into a career. Elliot had an eye for moments, raw, unscripted, and emotional, and his photos often evoked something deeply personal in those who viewed them. But his life changed forever the day he stumbled upon the antiquarian's vault. Nestled on a quiet cobblestone street, the shop was filled with oddities, dusty globes, rusted jewelry, and shelves crammed with books whose spines bore titles in languages Elliot didn't recognize. He had been wandering the city, looking for inspiration, when the store's dimly lit interior caught his eye. Looking for anything in particular? The shopkeeper asked, an elderly man with a peculiar smile. No, just browsing, Elliot replied. But his attention was immediately drawn to an old camera displayed in a glass case near the counter. It was a vintage medium-format camera, its leather casing cracked and worn with age. The metal accents were tarnished, but the lens gleamed as if it had just been polished. It seemed to call to him. How much for the camera? Elliot asked. The shopkeeper's smile widened. Ah, the Zephyr. A rare piece. Quite special, you know. Elliot chuckled. Special how? Let's just say it captures more than what meets the eye. Intrigued and with the price surprisingly low, Elliot bought the camera and hurried home, eager to test it out. Elliot lived in a small, cluttered apartment filled with stacks of photo books, lenses, and prints scattered across every available surface. That evening, he loaded the Zephyr with a roll of black and white film and took it out into the city. He photographed the usual subjects: street musicians, bustling markets, and children playing in the park. The camera was heavier than his digital equipment, but there was something satisfying about the mechanical click of the shutter. When he developed the film later that night, however, his excitement turned to confusion, and then to dread. In every photo, there were figures that hadn't been there when he took the shot. A pale woman in a long dress stood behind the violinist he had photographed at the park. A shadowy figure loomed in the background of the market scene, its face obscured by a dark hood. In one of the most chilling images, a young boy with hollow eyes sat on the swing beside the laughing children. Elliot stared at the prints, his hands trembling. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light or some kind of double exposure, but the details were too sharp, too vivid. These figures, these ghosts, were as clear as the living subjects in the frame. Over the next few weeks, Elliot couldn't stop using the Zephyr. Despite his fear, he was drawn to it, compelled to take more photos. The ghosts appeared in every shot, sometimes faint and distant, other times stark and undeniable. One night he ventured to an abandoned train station on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation for being haunted, and Elliot wanted to test the camera's limits. He set up his tripod and took a series of long exposure shots, the shutter clicking in the silence. When he developed the photos, his breath caught in his throat. The station was teeming with ghostly figures. A woman cradling a baby, a man in a conductor's uniform standing stiffly by the tracks, and a group of faceless passengers crowded on the platform. Their expressions were haunting, some mournful, others filled with rage or despair. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts were looking directly at him, as if aware they were being captured. It wasn't long before the ghost began to invade his life in other ways. At first it was subtle, the faint sound of whispers in an empty room, cold spots in his apartment, the sense of being watched. One night, as he was reviewing his latest batch of photos, he heard a voice. "Why are you doing this?" Elliot spun around, his heart pounding, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" he demanded. The voice came again, softer this time. "Stop taking our pictures." The next morning, Elliot found scratches on the walls of his apartment. They looked like letters, but they were too jagged to read. Determined to understand what was happening, Elliot returned to the antiquarian's vault. The shopkeeper greeted him with the same peculiar smile. "Ah, the photographer returns. How are you enjoying the Zephyr?" Elliot slammed a stack of ghost-filled prints on the counter. "What the hell is this? What's wrong with this camera?" The shopkeeper didn't look surprised. Instead, he sighed and adjusted his glasses. "The Zephyr has unique properties. It reveals what most can't see, the remnants of those who passed on." "You knew about this," Elliot shouted. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I did," the man replied calmly. "I told you it captures more than what meets the eye, but I suspect you wouldn't have believed me if I explained further." Elliot leaned in, his voice trembling. "How do I stop it?" The shopkeeper hesitated. "The camera isn't cursed per se. It's a tool, but tools have consequences. The more you use it, the stronger the connection between you and the spirits becomes. Eventually, they'll follow you, not just into your photos, but into your life." Elliot's blood ran cold. Over the following weeks, Elliot's life became a waking nightmare. The ghosts weren't confined to his photos anymore. They appeared in his apartment, their translucent forms flickering like old film. At night, they whispered to him, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. "Why won't you let us rest?" one would ask. "You don't belong here," another would hiss. One evening, he awoke to find a pale woman from the park standing at the foot of his bed. Her eyes were sunken, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Elliot tried to destroy the camera, smashing it against the floor and throwing it into the fireplace, but it remained unscathed. No matter what he did, the ghost kept coming. Desperate for answers, Elliot decided to take one last photo, with himself as the subject. He set up the Zephyr on a tripod, positioned it in front of a mirror, and pressed the shutter. When he developed the photo, his blood turned to ice. Standing behind him in the reflection were dozens of ghosts, their faces twisted with rage. But what terrified him most was his own image. His reflection looked wrong. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and translucent, just like the spirits he had been capturing. In that moment, Elliot realized the truth. The camera hadn't just been photographing ghosts. It had been turning him into one. Weeks later, Elliot's apartment was found abandoned. His friends and colleagues reported him missing, but no trace of him was ever found. The only clue was a single photograph left on his desk, a self-portrait of Elliot, standing among a crowd of ghosts, his face a perfect blend of despair and acceptance. The Zephyr camera, it was never recovered. But rumors began to spread of a strange old camera appearing in secondhand shops across the country, always finding its way to new hands. And with every new owner, the ghost would return, captured forever in the haunting lens.